Hello everybody, welcome to my first video on In the Spectacles by JB Priestley. This one's going to be focusing on context. So as always, when I start my context videos, I explain that it's really important that you try and climb up the mark scheme by making specific links between context, text and task. And it's important that you show a clear understanding of not just contextual factors, so I think students tend to think of this as kind of historical facts, but it's about a lot more than that. It's about showing an understanding of some of the key ideas and also perspectives. So how Priestley kind of explored different ideas through his perspective, and also how different audiences might receive those ideas as well. And it is worth up to 6 marks, so it is a really important aspect of your essays because that can work out at 20% of the overall mark. So some key facts about this text. It's in the form of a play. It was first performed in 1945. The monarch on the throne at the time was King George VI, and the name of the era can either be the post-war era or the Cold War era. Now, just to confirm, that is the name of the era that it was written in, not the name of the era that it is set during. The name of the era that it's set during is the Edwardian era. So let's start off with the key question, why did JB Priestley write this text? First and foremost, he wanted to encourage social responsibility, and he himself was a socialist, a very outspoken socialist, and he wanted to share that vision and to spread that message. He also wanted to highlight the progress that had been made in society since 1912 in terms of class differences, and also this idea of social mobility. And if you're not sure what social mobility means, I have put it up in the glossary up here. It's essentially the idea that someone can rise up within the class system, so from working class to middle or from middle to upper. And we see that happening in the play. We see different characters wanting to rise up. For example, Mr. Burling is in the middle class. He wants to rise to the upper class by getting a knighthood. And there's a few others as well that we can explore. He also wanted to encourage the audience to consider their own prejudices. And perhaps he wanted the audience sitting in the theatres to think to themselves, well, actually, do I need to take anything from this? Do I need to learn some lessons here, either about how I view class or how I view gender, or my own impressions of people based on maybe ageist views that I have? So maybe the older members in the audience would be doing some self-reflection there. And I'll talk more about that in a moment, but also in the other videos that I'll be making, specifically the theme video, where we'll talk about the theme of age and the generational gap. We're going to be looking at 5 key areas of context in this video. First of all, just some very key details from Priestley's life. It's really important that you don't just chuck in a full biography of these authors, and that you do just pick out the most pertinent, judicious areas that really tell the message that you need it to tell. Also, just a quick note about the first performances of the play, because I do think that that's worth talking about. Obviously need to talk about social class, because that's probably the most important aspect of this text. The differences between 1912 and 1945, and why did Priestley set the play back in 1912 when he wrote it in 1945? And also we'll be ending by talking about women's rights and patriarchy. Okay, so I know there's a lot of text. Please don't feel overwhelmed. If you're watching this on a phone, you will not be able to see all of this. So I'll just read out the most important parts. So the first thing that I wanted you to kind of be aware of is that Priestley grew up in the middle classes, but made a conscious decision to spend time with the working classes. So when he was 16, he took a job in a wool firm, so essentially a factory. And he did this because he said he wanted to get more of a feel for the real world. And he wanted to know what it was like to be in the working class and to have those kind of long hour jobs and those grueling manual labour jobs. Also, during the First World War, he joined the army and he narrowly avoided death on a number of occasions. Now, the fact that I think this is important is it shows that he's willing, again, to get stuck in, to kind of not shy away from something perhaps not as pleasant as other things that he could be doing. And And it also shows that he might have had a greater appreciation for life and death and the thin line that lies between them. And I think that comes through with the death of Eva. And this next point is very important. You do need to be aware that Priestley himself set up a political party. It was called the Commonwealth Party, and its main kind of manifesto, if you like, the main point of it being was that he wanted to tackle social inequality. So it was a very much a left-wing socialist party. The new party wanted public ownership of land. They wanted greater levels of democracy, and they wanted a new kind of morality in politics. Now, this party went on to merge with the Labour Party in 1945, and of course, the Labour Party actually won in 1945, a very famous victory, post-war victory. And so you could argue that J.B. Priestley had quite a large hand in this very important election result in 1945. So Priestley was, a big person in society. He was very well known. He's quite a famous kind of character around town. Everyone knew of him. Everyone knew of his political stance and what he stood for. And it is important as well that you understand that this is a very kind of landmark date, 1945, and this formation here of the Labour Party. That was when the welfare state was introduced. Now, the welfare state is what we kind of see today as the benefit system. And it's also when the NHS was set up. So this really crucial socialist, democratic time in our history that J.B. Priestley was involved in, very much involved in. It's also important that you know that he put on a very popular weekly radio programme during the Second World War. And the show eventually got cancelled because they felt that it was too left-wing. They felt that it was spreading, socialist ideals, and the government at the time during the war was conservative. So, for example, Winston Churchill, if you've heard of him, one of the most famous conservative prime ministers, they just weren't happy. They just weren't happy with the message he was spreading, and so it got shut down. So the first performances of play, it was published and performed in 1945, and it was first put on in the Soviet Union, which is the old name for Russia. So I'm sure you know already, but Russia is a very left-wing country. In fact, it's communist. And by this date, they already had a very well-established communist leadership and government in place after the Russian Revolution of 1917. Now, the reason that he gave for why he put them on in Moscow and Leningrad was because he said that suitable theatres could not be found in England. I think that's a really interesting quote. Is he saying that it was like a physical reason, so he couldn't find theatres in England that maybe were shaped in the way he wanted the stage to be shaped, or maybe that just the theatre itself, like perhaps he wanted a proscenium arch theatre and could only find it in the round? Not sure. But I also think you could make a different inference here. I think he wanted to put this on to a left-wing audience to see how they would find the play. I think it's really important to note, he very much chose to put this on in the Soviet Union. He can give any reason he wants, but I think it's a very deliberate choice on his part. So that's something that you could explore in your essay. It's also important that you know that when this was first put on, class divisions were becoming a lot more blurred, and people wanted to see that continue, or most people wanted to see that continue. He wanted the people of Britain to embrace change and to make the most of the social upheaval that the two world wars had caused. Like I said, the social class system was becoming a lot more blurred, but back in 1912, it was extremely rigid. So you had this situation in 1912 where you had very, very strict kind of rules. So we had the landed gentry, which are the nobility who own land, and people who had inherited wealth. Then you kind of had these three sections here. So you've got the aristocracy, so people with titles, so the lords and ladies, the dukes, etc. Then you've got the upper classes, or the upper to middle classes. Now, it is worth noting as well that Sybil is slightly higher class than her husband. Upper middle classes, they would be people who kind of own their own businesses, are doing quite well, making good profits. Then you've got the middle classes, so that would be people who don't own their own businesses but still have good jobs. So things like doctors, lawyers, things like that. And then you've got the working classes, so people that typically would do manual jobs, things like that. So that's people like Eva Smith. We've also got these other terms here that I do think it's worth you kind of knowing, if you don't know them already. People like Karl Marx, if you've heard of Karl Marx, developed theories around this. So people who were kind of in power and the upper classes would be known as the bourgeoisie. So these are the people that have the kind of controlling share of wealth in a country. And then the working classes were known as the proletariat, or proles for short. And this is your kind of the typical working man. So the people who are out there every day, working long hours, bringing in income for their family, and kind of barely getting through money-wise. These two terms would be great to use in your essays. You definitely get A or 4 marks for using these correctly. So let's look at some of the differences between 1912 and 1945. In 1912, there was a huge difference in wealth between the upper and lower classes. The disparity was staggering, actually. I think there's a figure somewhere I read that the top 5% of the country owned 90% of the wealth, meaning that it was all very much hidden away in these upper classes and their businesses and their kind of properties and land and things like that. And then you've got the other 95% of the country who don't own that and don't have good wealth, and who are just, doing backbreaking jobs, never seeing any kind of real rise in their own income or profits. Linking on to that, a working class person's day was very long, 11 or 12 hours with few breaks, whereas many rich people didn't work at all. And it very much was the case that the rich had all the power and the poor had little to none. Now, going to 1945, the difference between wealth lessened, so the gap actually got a lot shorter between these two, and this was mainly due to the war. Things like rationing, which put everyone on an even keel. So rationing was where you were only allowed a certain amount of food each week. You got a ration book with stamps in. You'd be allowed, for example, for a family of 4, you'd be allowed a certain number of eggs, milk, bread, and that's it. So that's all you would get. There was, of course, a black market where you could get more, but on the whole, this did really help with things like wealth distribution. Working conditions started to be improved. Like I just said, in 1945, you had the Labour Party come into power, and as you can guess from the name Labour Party, they very much put the kind of working classes and the people who are involved in manual labour, they tend to put them first in their priorities. And a lot of the legislations or bills that they put through tend to prioritise the working classes. And this had a knock-on effect that power was more evenly distributed. Another huge thing to consider, and this is why I've put this picture here on my slide, is that we'd had the war. We'd had 2 wars, in fact. And not only were there all these changes happening politically, but when you're in war, when you're down in those trenches, social classes tend to melt away. When that whistle blows and you have to run over the top, go into no man's land, put your life on the line, it's a great leveler. It's a great leveler that puts everybody on the same place. There's no element of, oh, you're upper caste, you're working class. You all work together, you all fight together, and you all die together. And when you're back in the trenches, overnight, you play card games together, drink together, eat together, and it was very much a community. And so the men that went through that would have had a very kind of different view of social class when they got back home. And then there's other things as well. So stately homes, big homes of the time, palaces even, were converted into several things, sometimes converted into kind of army bases, but more often not converted into things like hospitals. And so you had lords and ladies having to actually help out and become volunteers. So again, the power and class tended to kind of not melt away, but was a lot less important. I think people started to appreciate the really important things in life, because a situation like war will do that to you. It makes you appreciate things in a very different way. So moving on to women's rights, a key term here to use is patriarchy. Patriarchy is a society where men hold the power and women are largely excluded from it. So around the time of 1912, this is really when women's rights took off massively. So you had people like the suffragists and the suffragettes fighting for equality for women. The main thing that they were fighting for at the start was votes for women, because you've got to remember 1912, women did not have the vote still. Women did not get the vote for at least 10 years after this. That's all women. Some women did a little bit sooner, but all women got it. I think it was 1930, but just check that. So it really was important that, Priestley wanted to shine a light on this and just make people remember how far women's rights had come just in those 33 years between when it was set and published. 1928. It's on the slide right in front of me. That's when all women got the vote, 1928. Now, there were two different groups around. Some of the groups took militant action, which means they did not, remain peaceful in their protests. And they did things like hunger strikes, so they'd tie themselves to railings and refuse to eat until they got what they wanted. But there was other groups as well who took a lot more kind of passive approach and did other more kind of peaceful things to try and affect things as well. I think it's worth noting here, the reason I'm talking about all this, we've got the character of Eva Smith, who Burling describes as being a bit of an upstart, as someone who really is causing a bit of a scene at his factory, and he doesn't like it. So I think he calls her a ringleader, and he says that, she's causing trouble, stirring trouble amongst the girls in the factory, because she was lobbying for higher wages, and he did not like that. But like I said, the war again had a huge effect on the patriarchy. There was a lack of men at home, and after the war as well. So women started doing the jobs that had been deemed masculine or macho. So jobs like manual labour and engineering, women started taking on the role of doing them. At first it was out of necessity, but they soon proved their competence. And so we had women in a lot more jobs that I guess nowadays we'd call STEM jobs. And of course they absolutely nailed it. You had lots of posters around at the time, such as these, propaganda posters if you like. So you've got the image here of women in like typical kind of male jobs. So army roles, RAF roles, nurse, doctor, factory workers, builders, car mechanics, you name it. So there's some questions here to answer that are just things that I've kind of pondered on throughout the video. So if you want to pause it here and answer these in class, if you're in class with your teacher, or if you're doing this at home, maybe for home learning, then you could answer these and submit them, and I'm sure your teacher would be able to give you some feedback on them. And there's some links here to further study as well. So obviously this PowerPoint will be shared with you on your Teams. And so you can go through these links in your own time. This last one in particular, I'd highly recommend. This is a BBC podcast all about J.B. Priestley and his life. So again, you can make those links between his life and the play, because there are some, I think. So I'll leave it there for today. Thank you very much for watching. Hope you found it useful. And if you can think of anything else I could add in, then I'd love to hear your feedback. So let me know. All right. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.